Well, we have been looking at the book of Ruth, which is the story of Ruth and her mother-in-law, Naomi. 2 weeks ago, we saw how both of them had become widows and how in their society, that created a problem for how they would survive in the future. In the ancient world, your retirement plan was based on being married and having children. That's how you were going to get by in your later years. Now, if you missed any of that, videos on YouTube, you can watch that. But the short version is what we looked at is that if a man died, his brother had the responsibility of marrying his widow to raise up children in his brother's name. And this would make it so that the family line continued, but also that's how they provided for her so that she would be cared for in her old age. In the case of Ruth, her brother-in-law had also died. Naomi's husband died, and both of her sons died. And so Ruth was faithful, we saw, to care for her mother-in-law, even to the point of leaving her own family, leaving her own people there in Moab, and moving to Bethlehem to make sure Naomi was taken care of. She took care of Naomi. Ruth worked harvesting all season, we saw last week, to make sure they both had food. But how could Naomi, an older widow with no children left, help provide for Ruth's future? How was she going to provide for Ruth? That is the question, the question that is the basis of what we're going to look at today in Ruth chapter 3, where Naomi devises a plan on how to catch a husband. Okay, and so I think you'll probably find this an enjoyable chapter, at least interesting. And so let's dive in. Ruth chapter 3, beginning in verse 1. Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi, said to her, "My daughter, shouldn't I find rest for you so that you will be taken care of? Now, isn't Boaz our relative? Haven't you been working with his female servants? This evening he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Wash, put on perfumed oil, and wear your best clothes. Go down to the threshing floor, but don't let the man know that you are there until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, notice the place where he is lying. Go in and uncover his feet and lie down. Then he will explain to you what you should do." So Boaz was the kinsman redeemer for their family. That's kind of how we ended last week's chapter. Or in other words, maybe in our society, we would say he was in line to be the next of kin. Okay, that's a concept we still have in our society. We will ask people, who's your next of kin, so that we know what family member to notify, if something happens to them, if they're incapacitated, if they die, if they land in the hospital, who do we call? We want to call the next of kin. It's the person who gets their property if they die to some degree. Your next of kin, whatever's yours kind of goes to them, whatever the government doesn't take, but it goes to them. Or who makes decisions about their medical treatment if someone is incapacitated, in the hospital. Who makes decisions? Well, usually it's the next of kin. Or who makes the decisions about their funeral arrangements? It's often the family, the next of kin. And so Boaz would have likely been in line for these sorts of things, these decisions in their culture, like we looked at 2 weeks ago. But he was also in line to marry the widow in the family to raise up children to preserve the family line. A little more distant than the brother-in-law, but it seems that they extended that out. We saw 2 weeks ago that when a woman became a widow, their custom was that she would marry her brother-in-law, so they would have children to carry on the deceased's name and to inherit their property. These children were their means of Social Security. Okay, there were no nursing homes, there was no Social Security check. Your kids had to take care of you when you got old. And for most of us, that would be bad news. But that is kind of the way, it worked. They would provide for them and care for them when they got too old to care for themselves. Since both of Naomi's sons had died, she cooked up a plan to marry Ruth to their kinsman redeemer, a close relative that would take her son's place in the arrangement of providing for Ruth. So Ruth would have a husband. She would have long-term security. She could have children. And Boaz had shown them great kindness. So why shouldn't she marry Boaz? And that seems to be where Ruth is, or where Naomi is going with this plan. Naomi's motivation seems to be to take care of Ruth. Ruth had been faithful in taking care of her. Ruth had committed herself to that family, and she had kept that commitment by taking care of her mother-in-law. So shouldn't Naomi now be equally faithful? Shouldn't she now make sure Ruth is taken care of? And when Ruth gets older, that she has someone to take care of her. And so Naomi's plan is to do this by marrying Ruth to Boaz. Not that, elderly women would ever have other motives in matchmaking or like to do that. But, Naomi is playing matchmaker. And so Naomi points out to Ruth that Boaz is the man she ought to go after. Not that young women ever get advice on who to go after, but that's what Naomi is doing here. Well, how should she do that? How do you catch a husband? Here is what the way the young woman in her culture should propose marriage. And that would be the question. I mean, how does a woman in her culture propose marriage to a man who has shown her kindness? Naomi's instructions are this. She said that Ruth first should wash, put on perfume, and put on her best clothes. It may be comforting to know that the concept of courting, this part of courting, the courting ritual has not changed in 3,000 years. Okay? Even today, in today's world, if you're trying to attract a man or a woman, usually you start with personal hygiene. Okay, that's a good plan right there. And then you follow that by trying to look good and trying to smell good. Okay, I still think that's the plan most young people follow when they're trying to attract someone. These are important details, and in case there's any young single people taking note today, these are important details. If you're married, we're going to assume you already have caught on to this and have figured out these details. The second part of Naomi's instructions to Ruth was that she should go to the harvest party, basically, but wait until Boaz had finished eating and drinking and lies down to rest after the party. Now, this is kind of a different concept for us. Most parties in the ancient world were sleepovers. Okay, that's just kind of the way their parties ran. That's not saying they had inappropriate behavior. That's just they celebrated and then they'd eat and they'd drink and they'd fall asleep. That's just kind of how, most of the ancient world ran. But they lived in a world that didn't have personal bedrooms and everybody slept on the floor anyway. So, it's not so different. In terms of how Ruth was to approach Boaz, she was to wait until he was well fed and marry from the celebration. And in almost any circumstance in life, that's good advice. You will get better answers from people if they're well fed, happy, versus if they're busy, if they're stressed or hungry or unhappy, you're not going to get as good of an answer. So, it's not a bad idea. I guess this would fit in with the way to a man's heart is through his stomach. I mean, so she's waiting until he's well fed before she makes her move. So finally, Ruth was to watch where Boaz settled down to sleep and then go uncover his feet and lay down next to him. According to Naomi, Boaz would then take over with the instructions for Ruth at that point. Now, I know for those of you ladies who are married, this is how you caught your husband, right? You went and uncovered his feet in the middle of the night. I mean, no? Any of you? I mean, this is not, okay, this seems bizarre to us. We can get with the wash, wear good clothes and perfume, but this part of it, just our customs, for marriage proposals rarely involve bare feet. It just doesn't, it's not part of what we do. But this is what Naomi told Ruth to do. And so we read this, Ruth chapter 3, beginning of verse 5, says, "So Ruth said to her, 'I will do everything you say.' She went down to the threshing floor and did everything her mother-in-law had charged her to do. After Boaz ate, drank, and was in good spirits, he went to lie down at the end of the pile of barley, and she came secretly, uncovered her feet, and lay down." So Ruth followed Naomi's instructions. For those who are young people this morning, I'll tell you there's some wisdom here. Sometimes your elders know how the world works, and listening to them can be helpful. Okay, maybe not in terms of tech support, but in other things, Okay, listen to your elders. You can get some valuable advice. And so after Boaz had eaten and drank and he's merry from his harvest party, he lays down there at the threshing floor and he falls asleep. So Ruth comes, does exactly what Naomi says, uncovers his feet and lays down at his feet. She followed Naomi's instructions to a T. So let's see what happens. Continuing, verse 8, Ruth chapter 3 says, At midnight, Boaz was startled, turned over, and there lying at his feet was a woman. So he asked, Who are you? I am Ruth, your servant, she replied. Take me under your wing, for you are my family redeemer. Then he said, May the Lord bless you, my daughter. You have shown more kindness now than before, because you have not pursued younger men, whether rich or poor. Now don't be afraid, my daughter. I will do for you whatever you say, since all the people of my town know that you are a woman of noble character. Yes, it is true that I am a family redeemer, but there is a redeemer closer than I am. Stay here tonight, and in the morning, if he wants to redeem you, that's good. Let him redeem you. But if he doesn't want to redeem you, as the Lord lives, I will. Now lie down until morning. And so what we're seeing here is Boaz went to his annual harvest party, and he woke up in the middle of the night with a woman laying at his feet. He was shocked, and while he may have had a good party, it wasn't that kind of a party, okay? It wasn't, his reaction was to say, Who are you? And usually in any culture, after a party, you wake up with a woman next to you and you have to say, Who are you? That's a bad thing, okay? That's where Boaz is finding himself. I'm just saying, that's a bad thing. But remember, they didn't have electricity. This is the middle of the night. There's probably not much light, if any. So Boaz couldn't have seen who she was, just that someone was there. So it's a very reasonable question. Say, who are you sleeping at my feet? And Ruth had uncovered Boaz's feet in the middle of the night, and he woke up in the middle of the night. My guess is because he had cold feet. I mean, that's probably her method of waking him up. She's getting this, set up this conversation. People, I don't know, it's just, don't people usually like to have their feet covered while they're sleeping? I mean, you might not cover everything else, but a lot of people cover their feet. So I know I want a blanket at least on my feet. But Boaz was out enough that it took him till the middle of the night to wake up, even with this. This may be the only time in history where cold feet caused a marriage. That'd be, I can't think of another recorded, time. But Ruth tells Boaz who she is and what she wants was for him to take on the role of the kinsman redeemer and marry her. She's proposing. She's proposing to Boaz. And Boaz seems very excited at this prospect, seeing that, this is an even greater kindness than everything else she had done to Naomi. That's what he says. This is a greater kindness than all you've done before. Now, the Bible doesn't tell us these two individuals' ages, so we really don't know how old they were. I was trying to research, is there any history on this? Jewish tradition is that Boaz was 80. That would be from the Midrash, the Jewish tradition. But we really don't know. What we do know is Ruth would have been considerably younger. She's still in her childbearing years. She's still young enough to have a child. And he seems to really be excited that, she's willing to have this commitment with him being older. We don't know their exact ages, but Boaz specifically sees that as her kindness, that she didn't go after younger men. Whether rich or poor, she didn't go after the younger guys, she went to him. And so the age difference between them seems to be enough that Boaz is surprised and grateful for the offer. However, in a dramatic turn of events, this would make a great movie, in a dramatic turn of events that could foil all of Naomi's wedding plans, Boaz introduces a new piece of information. There's someone else who technically qualifies as the next of kin. He is a close relative, but he's not the closest relative. There's someone else who is closer. He would gladly marry Ruth, But this other person has rights of first refusal, both to her and to the land Elimelech had apparently left behind. There's land involved in this deal. And so that is part of it. Now keep in mind that in their society, the land had been distributed to each family by divine decree under the administration of Joshua. Each family, each tribe was parted out their land. And so the land could be temporarily sold, we might call it rented, but then eventually when they get to the year of Jubilee, it goes back to the family to whom it was assigned. However, if you live in an agrarian society where farming is your primary means of making a living, waiting 50 years to the next year of Jubilee can really hurt your economy. I mean, you're going to be without your land, and that's how you make money, is off your land. If they had a relative with the financial means to do so, and who was qualified as the next of kin, then they had the right to buy back the land. Okay, keeping it in the family was priority under Jewish law. They had the right to buy back the property. And in this way, they did keep the land in the family to whichever family it had been assigned by God through Joshua. It always went to the closest living relative. However, the kinsman redeemer idea went much further than just land. If you were in debt and were sold into slavery to pay your debt, the kinsman redeemer is the relative who, if they had the financial ability, had the right to buy you back. They could come pay your debtor and buy you back out of slavery and set you free. There was an expectation that when you were part of a family, they would take care of you. Okay, you took care of your family. That was a biblical expectation. And so in the case of Ruth and Naomi, it would seem that there was land that belonged to Elimelech, who had died. His sons had died. And so now this land needs to be redeemed in order to keep it in the family. But in Israel, the person who redeemed it, who redeemed the assigned land, also had to redeem any widow. The land and the person, the family, were inseparable. So this kinsman redeemer, if he bought the land, also had to provide for the female who was the widow of the landowner by marrying them and raising up children in the name of the deceased. Now, all of this plays into Ruth's story. Boaz was the relative through whom God was providing for Ruth and Naomi. We saw that in the last chapter, but he was a relative. There is a relative who is more closely related, and we'll see how that plays out in the next chapter. And that person has the first rights to the land and thus the first responsibility for the widow. And so Boaz tells Ruth, lay down and get some sleep, and tomorrow we'll figure out who's going to marry you. That'd make you sleep well, right? That's what he says. Lay here and get some sleep, and we'll work this out tomorrow. Boaz does reassure her that if the closest relative won't redeem her and the land, then he will. So one way or another, Ruth is going to be provided for. She's going to get married. She's going to have a husband. She's going to have her Social Security. The land is going to stay in the family. It's taken care of, but the question is, which relative will do it? She and Naomi will have security for the future. So I guess that is kind of a reassuring thing. Verse 14, we see this. It says, so she lay down at his feet until morning, but got up while it was still dark. Then Boaz said, don't let it be known that a woman came to the threshing floor. And I think this is significant for us to note. I told you that in the ancient world, parties often turned into sleepovers. That was a common thing. That does not mean that they were always immoral in their behavior. In fact, in this case, it would seem that there weren't any women at this party. I mean, this would kind of seem to me that the men, probably the property owners, after a long season of work, after all of their harvest is done, remember we saw she collects through the whole harvest, both the barley and the wheat harvest, they would work and then they'd get together, and probably the winnowing of barley was more symbolic or more of a tradition. And then they would eat dinner and drink and have kind of a party to celebrate the harvest being completed. It's like a harvest party of those guys who have, okay, hey, we've had a good year. We're going to get together and celebrate. Um, and I think maybe in our culture, it's not so very different what families might experience on Thanksgiving. In fact, I remember a time where we had Thanksgiving dinner at my house, or my parents' house, all my family was over. And it seemed like after dinner, the ladies were in the kitchen kind of cleaning up. And my dad, my uncle, and my step-grandfather all sat down on the couch to watch football, and all three of them fell asleep. They ate, they had a party, now they're there sleeping. Okay. I think that's kind of what we're seeing here. These guys got together for their celebration. The harvest is over, and they're happy. And so we should not think bad about Boaz in this dynamic. It seems that it was an odd thing that a woman snuck into the party. That wasn't a normal part of what they were doing. And he seems to want to preserve everyone's reputation. Let's not let anybody know you were here, kind of a thing. He wants to keep the matter a secret. However, from Ruth and Naomi's point of view, this may have been Ruth's clear opportunity to speak to Boaz in private. I mean, when he didn't have servants around, she can't get to him when he's in his home because, that's his house. How would she sneak in there? She can't talk to him out in the field if he's supervising all his workers. So here's an opportunity, and Naomi would have known this. The guys go there, they celebrate, they eat, they fall asleep, talk to him in the middle of the night. This is your chance. And that seems to be what we're seeing with Ruth. And so verse 15, Boaz continue his response. It says, and he told her, Ruth, bring the shawl you were wearing and hold it out. When she held it out, he shoveled 6 measures of barley into her shawl, and she went into the town. So Boaz also made it a point to give Ruth some food, not just a meal, but 6 measures of barley, which would have been a fair amount of support for her and for Naomi. Boaz is kind of acting on his responsibility as kinsman redeemer. I mean, he's providing for Ruth and Naomi, even if he may not be the one who gets to marry her. He's still providing for them. He's still caring for his family. And so I think that would have been part of what he's doing, but it also would have been seen maybe as a down payment or a pledge to Ruth. He's not sending her away empty-handed. We'll see that more in a second. And in our culture, we might usually give an engagement ring. Okay. He gave her a shawl full of barley, but, it was something that meant something to them. And that seems to be how Naomi takes it. And we'll see that here in a moment. Verse 16, look at this. It says, so she went to her mother-in-law, Naomi, who asked her, what happened to my daughter? Then Ruth told her everything the man had done for her. She said, he gave me 6 measures of barley because he said, don't go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed. Naomi said, my daughter, wait until you find out how things go, for he won't rest unless he resolves this today. See, Boaz knew Naomi's behind all this. I mean, they're relatives. He knows her. He knows who's behind all this, who put Ruth up to it. He sends Ruth back with barley so that he does not return to Naomi empty-handed. He's showing his commitment to this plan. He's involved in it. But Naomi clearly sees this as proof that Boaz will quickly act on these matters. He's going to take care of business, and that is what we'll see in the next chapter. And she reassures Ruth that he won't rest unless he resolves this today. Now, I don't know about you, but this whole story seems a little odd to me. Does it seem like an odd story? I mean, here we have the woman proposing to the man, a younger woman pursuing an older wealthy man, an old man who's excited at the prospect of marrying a much younger woman, an old widow who likes to play matchmaker. What I think is odd about this story is that it comes from the ancient world. It would fit into a modern soap opera just perfect. Okay? People haven't changed. And 3,000 years, people have not changed. But it is something that, you could see this dynamic on TV. However, if we aren't careful, we might miss Boaz's stated reason for being willing to marry Ruth, which was her character. Her character. Listen again to Boaz's response to her asking him to take her. This is Ruth chapter 3, verse 11. It says, "Now don't be afraid, my daughter. I will do whatever you say, since all the people in my town know that you are a woman of noble character." His stated reason for saying yes to this proposal is her character. See, Boaz was willing to gladly marry Ruth because she's a woman of noble character and everyone in town knew it. Her behavior made her a welcomed addition to the family. See, our behavior matters to our family, how we reflect on our family, how our reputation goes. And I think this is the most important quality in looking for a wife or a husband. And you see this in Proverbs chapter 31, beginning in verse 10. The author writes, "Who can find a wife of noble character? She is far more precious than jewels. The heart of her husband trusts in her, and he will not lack any good thing. She rewards him with good, not evil, all the days of her life." If you want to catch a husband, at least one that's worth catching, and most of them probably aren't, okay. But if you want to catch a husband, then the way to do it is to be a woman of noble character. And I would tell you the same is true in reverse. If a man is looking for a wife, the best way to be the right husband is to be a man of noble character. And I believe we see both in the story of Ruth. Here we have a woman of noble character who was willing to sacrifice herself for her family, for her mother-in-law, to go with Naomi and do this work to provide for Naomi. But we also see in Boaz a man of noble character who is willing to go out of his way to provide for Ruth and Naomi, two widows, even when he expected nothing in return. These are two people of noble character. And I believe in this story we're seeing God work to bring them together. A person's character is what endures. Beauty fades. Money can be lost. Our health can and will eventually decline. Hard times come on us all. This is why so many weddings make their vows for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health. Because if you're together long enough, you will eventually face all of those things. You'll face money struggles. You'll face hard times. You'll face the loss of health. Eventually you'll get old and you won't look like you did back when you got married. That's reality for all of us. But the character of a person, that continues on. And if you want a marriage that's rock solid, then it will need to be between two people of noble character. And you can have no character more noble than that which is like Christ. He is our ultimate example of the character we are to display, of the way we are to behave. We are to be like Jesus. And so to catch a husband or to catch a wife or to just be involved in a good, lasting relationship, even a friendship, I would suggest that the most attractive quality we can possess is a Christ-like character. Be like Jesus. It'll help all your relationships if you're like Jesus. And that can only come from God working in you, making you the right kind of person from the inside out. And in a manner of speaking, I do believe that is what we see in Ruth. From the very first chapter, she has committed herself to the God of Israel. She has told Naomi, I will go with you, and your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. She's committed herself to the God of Israel, and she's committed to doing what is right. And it showed in her character. And as a result, we see God does provide her with a husband. Now, next week we'll find out which husband. Cliffhanger here, or unless you read ahead, chapter 4. But there is that dynamic in her life.